Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
When I was 14, I handed my mom a short story I had poured 3 weeks of my soul into, printed it on the inkjet printer in the basement, slid it into a clear plastic binder, even drew a little cover for it with colored pencils like it was some big deal. It was called Dust on the Ceiling Fan. I still remember that. I had written it after watching a moth get trapped in our hallway light. And somehow that turned into a story about a man who believed the dust in his house was alive and whispering to him. It wasn't perfect. I was 14. But there was something there. Something original. But all my mom did was skim a few paragraphs while stirring spaghetti, then look up at me and say, "You'll never be as talented as Jason. You're just not wired like him." She didn't even say it to be mean. That's what made it worse. She said it the same way she might tell me I wasn't built for gymnastics, like she was just being honest and helpful. I stayed quiet. I always did back then. Jason, my older brother by 3 years, was the prototype of what you'd call Midwestern impressive. He wasn't a genius, not by any stretch, but he was 6 feet tall by sophomore year, decent at football, and had that charming, cocky thing going where teachers gave him a pass for showing up late just because he flashed that dimpled smile. He wasn't cruel, not intentionally, but he didn't need to be. The whole town sort of just made space for Jason. He'd walk into a room and suddenly be the center of it, even when he didn't say anything. My mom loved him the way you love a favorite coat. You don't really question why, you just reach for it again and again. She hung his old report cards on the fridge long after he graduated. She framed his JV basketball photo like it was a pro headshot. When he got a B+ in economics, she baked a cake. Me? I was the quiet kid in the background with books too old for my age. I read of mice and men in 5th grade and cried so hard I hid under my bed so no one would see. I filled spiral notebooks with poems, wrote entire pretend interviews where I imagined being asked where my inspiration came from. I watched my classmates at lunch and made up lives for them. One girl, I decided, was secretly adopted, and her real mom was a jazz singer in Chicago. These weren't just daydreams. They were worlds I built when the real one didn't have much space for me. But in our house, creativity wasn't currency. My dad had left when I was 9. Leaving behind a house full of heavy silences and overdue bills. My mom cleaned houses for a living and believed in hard work, plain effort, and not dreaming too big. She used to say, "If you're going to do something, make sure it pays a bill." I think somewhere deep inside, she was afraid for me, afraid I'd grow up with a head full of stories and nothing to show for it. But instead of saying that, she said I wasn't like Jason. The first time I learned Jason cheated on a paper, I was 16. I walked into the kitchen and overheard him whispering to Mom about how he had copied something from a website and the professor flagged it. She didn't yell, she didn't get mad, she just said, "Next time ask me, I can help you reword it better." I stood there in the hallway frozen because up until then I had actually thought maybe Jason really was smarter than me. But watching her protect him like that, not from consequences, but from accountability, was the moment I realized that the rules weren't the same for both of us. That night, I sat in my room with my spiral notebook open and wrote a scene where a mother hides her son's crimes by pretending they were misunderstandings, and her daughter watches, invisible, her voice stuck in her throat. I didn't show it to anyone. Over the years, I tried to recalibrate my expectations. I told myself not everyone gets a cheerleader mom. Some moms love you through casseroles and carpooling, and that had to be enough. But the truth was, I didn't need her to cheer for me. I just wanted her to see me, to read the words I had written and say, "This is good," or at the very least, "I see you tried." But that moment never came, not even close. When I turned 18 and graduated, Jason gave a speech at my party, about himself mostly, and Mom made him his favorite pie. She handed me a card with $20 in it, and a line that said, "Keep writing if it makes you happy, but don't forget to get a real job." I nodded, smiled, stayed quiet. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had already started sending out my stories to online journals under a fake name. One of them had even been published on a tiny site with a readership of maybe 100 people, and someone in the comments said, "This gave me chills." That one sentence meant more to me than all of Jason's trophies combined. I moved out 2 months later for college, state school, 2 hours away, with a major in English that Mom called a nice hobby, and I never brought my stories home again. I kept writing, quietly, obsessively. I didn't want applause. I just wanted to prove her wrong, even if she never knew it, because sometimes the loudest revenge is the one you whisper into your notebook, night after night, until the whole world reads it, except the one person you wrote it for. By the time Jason stumbled into what he called his first real job, I had already survived 2 years of college filled with late-night shifts at the 24-hour diner just off campus, mornings spent dog-tired in creative writing workshops, where I felt like a fraud among kids who had grown up with parents who actually encouraged them to speak out loud, and afternoons holed up in the campus library, revising the same 3 stories again and again until they started sounding like they belonged to someone else. Jason, on the other hand, had barely coasted through 4 years at some shiny, out-of-state college where the football team mattered more than the faculty, majored in communications, and managed to convince everyone, including himself, that he had some natural-born charisma that guaranteed him a future in advertising or brand strategy or some other vaguely impressive-sounding job you couldn't quite explain but still got a company car for. And sure enough, barely a month after he graduated, while I was eating instant noodles in a shared apartment with a broken window and a roommate who snored like a dying bear, our mother called to inform me, with the kind of smug excitement she usually reserved for Sunday church raffles or finding a purse on sale, that Jason had landed a job at a marketing firm downtown, thanks, of course, to networking, though it wasn't much of a secret that the hiring manager was an old high school acquaintance of hers who once had a thing for her lemon bars. She told me this as if it should bring me some comfort, as if Jason's success was a family victory, and not just another reminder of the way our paths were being measured on 2 completely different scales. His life a string of open doors and friendly handshakes, mine a slow grind of proving I deserved to be taken seriously. I congratulated her instead of him, because it was always her I had to congratulate when it came to Jason. He was her prize, her proof that she had done something right. I wasn't jealous, not in the way people think of jealousy, but I was tired of being the one who had to keep her head down and act grateful for every inch she carved out on her own, while Jason tripped forward and landed in another opportunity, his landing always cushioned by someone else's effort. By then, my anonymous blog had started to gather a quiet little following, nothing earth-shattering, just a few regular readers who left thoughtful comments, sometimes even sent emails asking if I was working on a book. I wrote under the pen name E.R. Lyman, a name that meant nothing but sounded like it could belong to someone serious, someone with a legacy, someone whose mother might read their stories aloud to relatives at Christmas. I didn't tell anyone it was me, not even my roommate. I guarded that small online world like a secret garden, and it was the only place where I didn't feel like the invisible daughter. Jason's job, as it turned out, was more of a temp gig with benefits than an actual career, but you wouldn't have known that from the way our mom carried on. She called me one Thursday just to tell me that Jason had been given his own extension number and that the company trusted him with clients. As if either of those things made him a CEO in waiting, I said, "That's nice," because anything else would have just opened the door to one of her lectures about how I should learn to celebrate other people's success, especially when those people were family. Meanwhile, I had just finished ghostwriting a 5,000-word lifestyle article for a mom blogger who was making 6 figures a year, rebranding other women's personalities into Pinterest quotes, and I wasn't even allowed to put my name on it. That fall, we all came home for Thanksgiving, and it was one of those long, exhausting meals where everything on the table felt like it had been cooked 3 hours too early and reheated twice. Jason walked in wearing a blazer that still had the tag on it and a watch he kept checking like he was waiting for someone important to call. He kissed our mother on the cheek, winked at me like we were in on some joke, and proceeded to spend the entire dinner explaining brand ecosystems to our 80-year-old aunt, who just wanted to know if he had a girlfriend. Our mom beamed like he'd just come home from saving a village, somewhere between the dry turkey and the lumpy mashed potatoes. He let it slip that he'd been laid off. The company was downsizing, or so he claimed, but there was something in the way he said it. Fast, a little too loud, followed by an immediate pivot to how he was freelancing now, that made it clear he hadn't seen it coming. I glanced at our mom, expecting at least a flicker of concern, but she barely blinked. Just patted his arm and said, "You'll bounce back. You always do." I wanted to ask her what it must feel like to believe so deeply in someone that even their failure seemed like a prelude to success. But I didn't. I stayed quiet. A week later, I received my first official rejection from a reputable lit mag, the kind that still published short fiction and had real editors and staff and funding. But the rejection came with a handwritten note from the editor-in-chief that said, "Your voice is strong. Keep going. This came very close." I printed it out and taped it to my wall. That single sentence meant more to me than anything anyone in my family had said in years. That winter, Jason announced he was going to write a book. He'd had an idea for a while, he said, and figured now was as good a time as any. Our mother clapped her hands and declared that creativity must run in the family, like it was a gene she'd always known existed in him and had just been waiting to blossom. She told him he'd need help getting the tone right, and without skipping a beat turned to me and said, "Maybe Rachel can help you. She knows how to make things sound polished." That was the moment I realized the truth. She didn't think I could write anything worth reading, but she believed I might be good enough to edit her son's ramblings into something readable. I smiled, nodded, and told her I'd think about it. But in my chest, something began to shift. Not anger, not quite yet, but a cold, sharp certainty that I was never going to be given a moment of my own. If I wanted one, I'd have to take it, quietly, completely, and without asking anyone for permission. When I finally agreed to help Jason with his so-called book, I did it less out of kindness or obligation, and more out of some quiet, bitter curiosity about what exactly he thought a book even was. Because deep down I suspected it wasn't about storytelling, structure, or character arcs, things I had obsessed over for years in silence, but more about image and legacy, another shiny badge to wear to holiday dinners so our mother could lean back and say to the relatives, "Both my kids are writers now," as though that was something she had nurtured in either of us. He sent me 10 pages in a Word document filled with sentences that wandered like bored teenagers and metaphors that landed with the subtlety of a brick through a window. It was a clumsy tale about a man who builds a coffee empire from a small-town cafe, thinly veiled autobiography with a side of hero worship, and not a single character who spoke like a human being. And yet, our mother was convinced it was brilliant. Her golden boy, turning experience into art, finally proving her instincts right. He asked if I could clean it up, and before I could stop myself, I said yes, not because I wanted to see him succeed, but because I wanted to see what would happen if I slipped in a voice that sounded less like him and more like me, subtle, sharp, observant, sentences that lingered like smoke and characters who felt like they carried bruises under their clothes. I rewrote the first chapter in one long sitting, giving the protagonist depth he hadn't earned, and a past that hinted at something more than shallow ambition. I changed the pacing, cut entire paragraphs, and wrote a new ending for the chapter that actually made people care. When I sent it back, I expected pushback, or at least a half-hearted suggestion to add more dialogue about the grind. But instead he called me the next morning, sounding breathless, and said, "This is amazing. I didn't know I was this good." That sentence hung in the air like a moldy towel, damp and smug, and I wanted to tell him that he wasn't, that it wasn't his voice on the page and never had been, but I didn't. I just let him talk while I muted the phone and stared at my laptop screen, wondering how long I could keep ghostwriting my own brother's ego before something inside me cracked. A week later, he submitted the chapter to a small regional contest for emerging writers, the kind of thing I had entered dozens of times under a fake name and never heard back from. He didn't even ask if he should mention me. Just hit submit and waited. And of course, he won. The ceremony was held at a tiny community center in a nearby town, barely 24 people in fold-out chairs, and an MC who kept losing his place in the program. I stood in the back with a lukewarm coffee, while Jason, in his off-the-rack suit and polished grin, accepted the award like it was the first step toward a Pulitzer, thanking his support system and his lifelong love of storytelling, which apparently included every English teacher he had ever mildly impressed, but somehow didn't include me. Our mother filmed the entire speech on her phone, her eyes shining with the kind of pride I had stopped trying to earn years ago, and afterward she hugged him so tightly you'd think he'd come back from war. She hugged me too, but it was the kind of side hug you give a cousin you haven't seen in 5 years. On the ride home, I stared out the window and tried to make peace with the fact that I had written something real, something people had responded to, and yet because it carried his name, I had to watch it become a success. It wasn't even the credit I wanted. It was the chance to finally step out of the shadow I hadn't asked to live in. But Jason's shadow had been shaped by our mother's love, which meant it stretched longer and darker than most, and I realized that as long as I was willing to stay quiet, that shadow would always find a way to cover whatever I built. When we got home, I didn't go inside. I stood on the porch for a long time, listening to Jason laughing inside with Mom while she reheated leftovers and teased him about being famous now. I wanted to feel rage or betrayal or something dramatic. But all I felt was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I walked to my car, drove back to my apartment, and opened a blank document. I started typing without a plan, without a title, without even knowing what the story was about. I just wrote sentence after sentence about a woman who rewrote the lives of people who had no idea she existed, about how the words we borrow shape the lives we build, and how sometimes the only way to be heard is to put your voice into someone else's mouth and let the world clap for the wrong person. That story became something else entirely. I revised it for months, sent it to a few contests and online magazines. It got some bites, a finalist nod, an honorable mention. And then, one day, it landed in the inbox of an editor who didn't just say good job, but asked if I'd consider submitting something longer, maybe a collection. I didn't tell anyone, not even the roommate I'd grown close to by then, because some victories feel too fragile to share. They need time to settle in your bones before they can survive the weight of other people's opinions. Meanwhile, Jason kept working on his book. But every chapter he sent me after that got worse, more desperate, less him, and more like someone trying to mimic a voice they didn't understand. I stopped rewriting them. I stopped answering his emails. I stopped letting myself be used as the scaffolding for someone else's hollow structure. I blocked our mother's number for the first time in my life, and it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for 20 years. I moved to Chicago in the spring, found a tiny studio with a leaking faucet and a view of nothing special, but it was mine. I took freelance editing gigs, taught a weekend workshop on story structure, and wrote every morning like it was the only thing tethering me to the earth. I didn't need applause. I didn't need a parade. I just needed the silence, my silence, to finally end. And in its place, I began to hear something else. The sound of my own voice, clear and sharp, finally free from the weight of being someone else's ghost. When I received the email from the Pulitzer Committee, I didn't scream or jump up and down or immediately call anyone, not even the few close friends I'd slowly collected in Chicago who knew me as Rachel the writer, not Rachel the younger sister of a washed-up marketing intern trying to be Hemingway without opening a book in his life, and certainly not Rachel the daughter of a woman who hadn't read a single page I'd ever published. Instead, I sat perfectly still in the kitchen of my apartment, holding my coffee mug like it was an anchor to a world I no longer recognized, watching the screen while those 5 words pulsed quietly in the subject line. Congratulations, you've won the Pulitzer for fiction. And I thought about all the nights I had spent sitting at that same chipped table, eating dinner out of a saucepan, because I didn't feel like washing dishes, writing stories with characters who said the things I never had the nerve to say out loud, and slowly teaching myself to believe that a life built around words no one asked me to write could still be something worth holding on to. The story that won, the one that had started as a quiet act of rebellion, a fictionalized reflection of years. I spent swallowing disappointment until it calcified into endurance, was about a woman raised in a house where silence was currency, and attention was a scarce, overvalued commodity. A woman who learned to mold herself into usefulness, just to earn proximity to love that was always rationed. It was the kind of story that made people email you saying things like, "I felt seen," or "I thought I was the only one," or sometimes, "just thank you." I had published it under my real name, finally, not hiding behind initials or pen names anymore. Because by then I wasn't interested in safety or anonymity. I wanted the world to know I existed, and that I had something to say that didn't require anyone's permission. Jason was the first one to text me. Not a congratulations or a saw the news or even a sarcastic brotherly dig like, "Guess you beat me to it," which might have at least carried some trace of humility. Instead, he wrote, "Crazy timing, I just got laid off again. Could use some work. Any chance you need an assistant? LOL." I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide if the absurdity of it was worth a reply, or if the best response was the same one I had given so many times before. Silence. He followed up an hour later with another text that said, "Seriously though, if you ever need help organizing or something, I'm great with people. Think about it." I didn't respond. I didn't delete it either. I just let it sit there, like a piece of old food in the fridge you can't bring yourself to throw away. Not because you'll eat it, but because you want to remember how long it's been sitting there, growing something you don't recognize. The second message I got wasn't from my mother, which didn't surprise me. I had already braced myself for her silence, the same heavy, invisible silence that had wrapped itself around every small success I'd scraped together over the years. The silence that wasn't angry or spiteful, but coldly dismissive, as if her refusal to acknowledge what I'd done was her way of reasserting control over the narrative, because if she didn't validate it, maybe it wasn't real, maybe it didn't count. Days passed. My name was printed in headlines. I was interviewed on podcasts, quoted in articles, invited to panels and literary events that had once seemed so far away, I didn't even bother fantasizing about them. And still, from her, nothing. When the email did finally come, the subject line was just "talk soon." No congratulations, no "I read your story," no mention of the award or the interviews or the fact that my face had been on the homepage of half the literary world for the past 72 hours. Just 2 words, an opening maybe, or a trap. I didn't open it. I stared at it in my inbox like a relic from a past life, and then I did something that felt both monumental and anticlimactic. I archived it. Not deleted, not replied, just quietly filed it away where it couldn't reach me anymore, because I knew, perhaps for the first time with real clarity, that I didn't need her response to validate what I had built. What I did need, surprisingly, was someone to share it with, not the credit or the fame, but the work itself, the joy of the grind, the details, the questions that make a story sing. So I hired a research assistant, not Jason, not anyone from my past, but a girl named Mia, a 24-year-old aspiring writer from my old town who had sent me an email weeks before with the kind of raw, awkward sincerity that reminded me of myself before I learned to hide it behind polish. She had read every piece I had ever published, referenced lines I had forgotten I wrote, and said she didn't want a job, just a chance to see how it all worked. I paid her anyway. I paid her more than I'd ever been paid when I started, because someone should get to feel what it's like to be valued from the beginning. Mia asked me once, during a quiet afternoon when we were editing a manuscript together, if I ever heard from my family. I told her the truth, only when they want something. She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. And then, like clockwork, Jason went on Facebook and posted a photo of my Pulitzer headline with a caption that read, "Proud of my little sister. Always knew she had it in her. Some of you may not know, but I actually inspired the story that won. Crazy, right? The comments rolled in. Old classmates and extended family liked it, left messages like, "Your family must be so proud, and talent runs in the blood." One even wrote, "You always had a way with words too, Jason." I didn't comment. I didn't correct him. I let him have his moment because I didn't need it anymore. The truth didn't require defense. My story wasn't his to explain, and I knew the people who needed to hear it had already found it. Not through a post or a headline, but in the pages where I had buried every quiet scream and silent wish and bitter, unspoken truth I had carried like a second spine for half my life. Jason was flailing, trying to tether himself to something meaningful, now that his own work, if you could call it that, had long since collapsed under the weight of its own emptiness. And our mother, she had started sending emails again, more frequent now, sometimes with links to articles she thought I should read, or updates about neighbors I didn't remember, like she was warming me up for a phone call she didn't know how to make. But I wasn't angry anymore. Not really, I was past that. I was something else, calm maybe, or just finally tired of dragging the past into every room I walked into. My revenge, if that's even the right word for it, wasn't about gloating or confrontation. It was about standing in the middle of my life, surrounded by the quiet hum of work I loved, with nothing left to prove and no one left to impress. Because sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to people who tried to shrink you is to grow so fully into yourself that there's no space left for their doubt. When the publisher confirmed that my memoir had not only been accepted, but was already generating buzz among early readers, some calling it raw, others calling it dangerous, a few critics whispering that it would stir the waters of familial expectation and suburban silence in a way that might make more than a few people uncomfortable, I felt something shift inside me. Not the way success usually lands in films with champagne and group hugs, but in a way that felt both intimate and deeply isolating, like standing in an empty house after the movers leave and realizing that everything you carried for so long is finally, unmistakably, behind you. The book wasn't born from bitterness, though parts of it inevitably were soaked in it, like pages left too long in the rain. It was born from something more complex, an ache, a need, maybe even a compulsion to place a mirror in front of the life I had lived without permission, to show what happened when a child grows up in the shadow of someone else's spotlight, and how sometimes the only way to survive that kind of invisibility is to create something no one can ignore. When the book tour was scheduled and my editor asked if I would consider doing a hometown reading, I said yes without thinking too much, not because I wanted to go back, but because I wanted to see the place, not the people, but the setting, through the eyes of the woman I had become, not the girl who had once begged for recognition in a house that only had one stage and one actor, the rest of us reduced to props. I didn't tell anyone in my family about the event, partly because I doubted they'd come, and partly because I suspected they would, especially her. And I wasn't sure which outcome would unsettle me more. The reading was held in the town's only independent bookstore, a narrow, slightly crooked little shop wedged between a nail salon and a dry cleaner, and as I stood behind the podium, reading aloud the chapter that had almost broken me to write, the one about the fictional mother who praised her son's lies and punished her daughter's truth with silence, I saw her. She was standing in the back, near the cookbooks, dressed like she was trying not to be noticed, her face careful and composed, though I could tell from the tightness in her mouth and the way her eyes flickered when mine met hers, that she had already read the book, probably more than once, and that she had come not for forgiveness or applause, but for some kind of understanding she wasn't ready to ask for in words. I finished the reading without stumbling, closed the book, and took questions from the small audience, most of whom asked thoughtful things about craft and character and the emotional toll of writing from life. Then a man raised his hand, middle-aged, polite, clearly local, and asked, "Was the mother character based on a real person?" The room went still, the air tightening like a pulled thread, and I knew everyone was waiting to see what I would say, especially her, standing there like the last ghost in a house I'd burned to the ground. I let the silence stretch for a moment, then said simply, "No comment," and let that be the answer. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either, and that felt like the most honest thing I could offer in that moment. A boundary wrapped in restraint. After the event, people lined up to have their books signed, and she didn't move, didn't try to get closer, just stood there as the line dwindled and the shop began to empty. When the last person left and I started packing my bag, she approached slowly, like someone afraid of stepping on a landmine. She didn't try to hug me. She didn't even smile. She just stood there holding a copy of the book she hadn't asked me to write and said, "Jason's not doing well. He's having a hard time." Her voice was flat, but there was something beneath it. Something strained, like she wasn't used to saying anything that wasn't measured for effect. I looked at her and said, "He'll figure it out. You always made sure of that." She nodded, not in agreement, but in resignation, like she'd been expecting that response and didn't know what else to do with it. There was a long pause, the kind that used to live in our house like furniture, and then she said almost softly, "You were always the strong one, Rachel." It was the first time she had said my name like it belonged to me, not like it was an afterthought or a mistake, or a label she attached to something she couldn't quite define. And I realized in that moment that maybe she hadn't known who I was at all. Not really, but she had read the book. And in reading it, she had met me for the first time. Not the daughter she thought she raised, but the woman who had carved herself into existence, word by word, in the margins of her indifference. I didn't cry. I didn't thank her. I didn't even offer her a seat. I just said, "I have to go," and walked out into the parking lot where the sky had turned the kind of gray that makes everything feel like it's suspended in time. Back at the hotel, I opened my laptop and found an email from Jason with the subject line, "Saw your interview. Wild ride, huh? Still proud of you." I didn't open it. I didn't delete it either. I just marked it as read and closed the browser. Later that night, Mia sat across from me in the lobby with a stack of notes for a new project. Her eyes wide with that kind of early career hunger I remembered so well, and asked if I thought we'd ever stop writing about our families. I told her the truth. Maybe not, but eventually, we write past them. She smiled, not entirely sure what I meant, but willing to wait for it to make sense. In the morning, before checking out, I opened the email from my mother. It was a short message, just a few lines. I finished the book. I'm not sure what to say, but I see you now. I read it twice, not because I needed to believe her, but because I wanted to understand how far we had come just to arrive at a sentence that simple. I didn't write back. I just closed my laptop, zipped my bag, and stepped into the morning sun, knowing that some stories don't need sequels, only silence.